See the wax ring.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our second session of C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. And our second reading this week was to be chapters 4 and 5 in book 1. And that was the required reading, but I hope you all took the time to read chapter 3 as well, because it certainly provided a little bit of amplification before we went to chapter 4. And so before we get into our study today, let's kick off with prayer. So, gracious Heavenly Father, once again, we thank you for the sun. And Lord, you provide us with so many signs in our world that you exist. You know, sometimes we call that the general revelation, but the promises that you made in your word continue to this day, continue in each of our lives. So Lord, as we prepare to consider Mr. Lewis's reading and understanding of who and what you are, I pray that your spirit would be upon each of those gathered here and all those who would watch this study as it's posted or as it's going on. Lord, watch over each one of us and bless us and guide us, and may our discussions be fruitful. We pray all this in the name of our risen Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. So last week, as we were reading chapters 1 and 2 in the opening book, because if you don't know this book, C.S. Lewis described it or delineated it into 4 separate books, and those 4 separate books corresponded to 4 different groups of radio addresses that he made. They were each 15 minutes long, that he made during World War II, and specifically when Germany was involved in bombing mostly London, but other areas in Germany during what they called the Blitz. That the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, was working to try to help people have a little bit of hope. So they asked Mr. Lewis to talk about something that was near and dear to him, or more specifically, they asked him to talk about his faith was one of those, and that's what he ended up talking about. He wasn't really interested, and I forget what the other thing they had asked him to talk about was, but he wasn't really interested in that. And every time he'd finish one of his radio addresses, they would ask him, well, how about some more? And so that's how it ended up being 4 books, 4 different series of radio addresses is what he was talking about. So last week we were talking about, he started his address talking about people quarreling. And he used that example of people quarreling because, you know, when you get in an argument with someone, each of us has an understanding of right and wrong. And he was trying to make the point that all human beings seem to have an understanding of right and wrong. And if they have an understanding of right and wrong, how do they have such an understanding? And so last week he was developing the idea that human beings maybe naturally have this understanding. And sometimes this sense of right and wrong causes human beings to do things that are dangerous to themselves to save other people. And that seems to be something that's beyond just ourselves. So that's what Mr. Lewis, Clive Staples, I always like to call him Clive Staples. That's what he was talking about last week. And so this week he's going to go on a little bit further in developing that idea. And you may not remember that, but last week, I'm going to read something that I read to you last week. And if I can find it, because I know that it's, I'm not far back. It's in the orange box. Next time, remind me to look in the orange box. But last week, what the question that we finished at kind of was a reference to something that Paul said in Romans 2, chapter 14 and 15. So I'm going to read it to you, and I'd like you to think about it as we watch our video this week. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciousnesses also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. Paul was telling the Romans, and he was telling us, that even people who don't know God, Gentiles who are outside the kingdom of God, have this sense of right and wrong. So where does this sense come from of right and wrong? And so as we continue our study today, we'll take a look at some of those ideas, if I can make technology work.
John, what's that scripture again?
It was Romans 2, verses 14 and 15. And
Although it was quite clear from the start
Can
that
everyone
Lewis would
hear
one
it?
day become a writer, it was far from clear that he would one day become a Christian. He'd been an atheist, a serious one, for most of his early life. One of the reasons the BBC asked him to give the series of radio talks that became Mere Christianity was because, as Lewis put it, he still remembered what Christianity looked like from the outside to people who were not Christians. When he was 17, Lewis summarized his religious views in a letter to Arthur Greaves, a friend he'd known since childhood.
I believe in no religion. There is absolutely no proof for any of them. And from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best.
15 years later, he would write to Arthur expressing a very different conviction.
Christianity is God expressing himself through what we call real things, namely the actual incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection.
Lewis's great change did not include a dramatic Damascus Road experience. It took Lewis all of that 15 years and a great deal of truthful self-reflection and careful thinking to change his mind. In 1917, when Lewis arrived here in Oxford, he was a student who believed in no religion. The college he attended was largely agnostic or atheistic, and so the young Lewis fit in well with a post-Christian, even anti-Christian atmosphere. This is the quad of University College, or UNIV as it's called. Right up there someplace is where an 18-year-old named Clive Staples Lewis lived when he was a student here. Years later, after his books were widely read on both sides of the Atlantic, Lewis began receiving requests to recount the story of his spiritual journey. People wanted to know how he'd gone from being a committed skeptic to a committed Christian. In response to these appeals, he wrote Surprised by Joy, the story of his life up to his conversion. Now, the title, Surprised by Joy, came from Lewis's own description of the mysterious longing he experienced for something more than he was. Even as an atheist, he felt an unsatisfied desire that was more desirable, as he put it, than any satisfaction. Lewis called this strange desire joy, always spelled with a capital J. This special feeling of joy would come and go sporadically. At times he felt it consistently, other times it would disappear for long periods. But when it did come, its presence was always fleeting, yet these momentary experiences always left him with a sense of something wonderful that lay just beyond his grasp. As a serious atheist, Lewis was not surprised by the joy he experienced. He was shocked by it. It made no sense to him that if, as he believed, there was nothing beyond nature, nothing beyond what he could see, touch, taste, and smell, then where did this longing come from? And why did it seem that nothing in this world could satisfy it?
Nearly all I loved, I believed to be imagery. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. I was, at this time, living like so many atheists, in a whirl of contradictions.
A thoroughgoing theist who felt an unearthly longing. This paradox would lead Lewis to ask serious questions about what he thought was real and what he took to be imaginary, and to look for serious answers. In this session, we'll explore what Lewis found when he, as a thoroughgoing atheist, asked the question, what lies behind the law of nature, behind the sense of right and wrong that we all share?
C.S. Lewis recognized that we lived in a world full of contingencies. If you see a toddler, you could presuppose that somewhere there were parents that produced that child. If you see a building, you can understand that there were architects and contractors and laborers who built the building. All of those things are contingent upon other things that were there prior. Lewis recognized then that in this universe, there must be something that's outside of the processes of contingencies, something that is necessary and eternal. But what would that be? And in Mere Christianity, Lewis deduces that there are at least two different approaches to this. One is a materialist approach, and the other is what he calls a religious approach or supernatural approach. The materialist approach believes that matter is eternal. It's always been there. It's something all of us were taught even in middle school. Matter is neither created nor destroyed, and we were fed at that time a particular worldview. But if in fact matter is eternal, the question comes, well, where do ideas come from? Where does justice come from? Where does a sense of love come from? You've never had a meaningful discussion with a rock. But the materialist says, oh, no, we can explain it all. The lovers don't really love each other. The man looks at a woman. Her image is projected on the retina of his eye through a series of electrical synapses. It travels along the optic nerve, stimulates the brain, causes secretion of particular hormones. And he says it's love. But the materialist says, no, it's not love. It's just matter, just chemistry. The problem is Lewis had bought that view when he was an atheist. It was a worldview that supported him in his atheism. But one day he saw the inherent contradiction. For you see, the materialist looks at the lovers and they project an image on his retina. A message travels along his optic nerve and stimulates his brain and causes secretion of particular hormones, and he calls it explanation. But he wants you to believe his explanation is valid even though the lovers can't really say love. And Lewis, in seeing the contradiction, came to the conclusion, he writes about it in Miracles, that I do not believe reason is mere cerebral biochemistry. And he rejected the materialist view. By contrast, there was the religious or supernaturalist view, that in fact the things that we see that are contingent in this world had their source from something that was not material, was ultimately immaterial, that is, was from God. Now, the scientists, Lewis understands, can tell us some things about this material world, but they have limitations. While the scientists can give us many good insights, there are some things they can't really talk about in a substantive way. John Polkinghorne, the Cambridge physicist, once said, if you ask the scientist, why is the kettle boiling? The scientist will give you an answer, and it will be heat from the burner is agitating the molecules of the water and causing the kettle to boil at 212 degrees at sea level. But Polkinghorne said, you could also say the kettle's boiling because I wanted a pot of tea, and would you like a cup of tea also? Now, the second answer is equally valid, but it's not an answer the scientists could get you to because they work with the quantifiable. They work with the measurable. And our world is far more complex and that can be reduced merely to the quantifiable and measurable. Years ago, I had an astrophysicist tell me that she lived by the principle, if she couldn't perceive it empirically, she just didn't believe it. And I said to her, well, could you set that principle forth for me empirically? And of course she couldn't. And in the moment that she had to admit that she couldn't, she saw the contradiction in her own principle. She had been an atheist, but after our conversation, she became an agnostic because she saw the problem. Lewis also saw the problem. Now, he believed that we can know, but the way that we know is interesting, and especially about religious truth. Ultimately, it comes from authority or revelation. As a matter of fact, before Lewis was a Christian, he was thinking about these matters, and he's reasoned his way through atheism and supporting materialism, agnosticism, and finally he becomes a theist. But at that point in his life, and surprised by joy, his autobiography, he said he didn't think he could know God personally any more than Hamlet could know Shakespeare. A year and a half later, C.S. Lewis became a Christian. And he realized that his image of Hamlet and Shakespeare was in fact a good one. For you see, Hamlet, the character of the play, could never break out the play to get to know the author, Shakespeare. But in fact, Shakespeare, the author, could have written himself into the play as Shakespeare, the character, and made the introduction possible. And Lewis said, that's what I believe happened in the incarnation. When God wrote himself into the play of human experience and made himself known to us through his son. Now, Lewis said we also have insider information. All of us have a sense of morality. We all sense what is fair play. We may not always see when we violate that, but if somebody around us violates it, we're quick to point it out right away. And if somebody accuses us of violating it, we're quick to make excuses and rationalizations for these things. Now, as Lewis writes about this, we see that he writes about it with great humility. Lewis isn't quick to point out the sins and shortcomings of others, but he does believe that if we're going to deal honestly with life, we have to deal with these shortcomings. And Lewis says one of the best ways to get people to do it is just to be honest about it ourselves. I suppose I could put it in context by telling a story. Years ago, I was asked to give an evensong service at Hartford College at Oxford University. The chaplain, a friend, invited me to sit at high table with the faculty after the meal was over. High table at Oxford University is fabulous. If you've ever seen the Harry Potter movies, the hall where they have their meals is the hall at Christ Church, one of the Oxford University halls. It's the most spectacular, of course. Hartford's not quite as grand, but it's not bad. Long tables run the length of the hall. Perpendicular to them and elevated about 2 or 3 steps is the high table where the faculty sit. If the students are eating roast beef, the faculty are eating prime rib. If the students are eating steak, the faculty are eating filet mignon. Everybody eats the high table meal in their academic gowns. The meal begins with a Latin prayer. The wine flows freely, and you could cut the pretense with a knife. It's not so bad if you don't take yourself too seriously, but in that environment, many people take themselves far too seriously. The chaplain introduced me as having spoken the evensong service, the Latin prayer. We all sit down. The woman who taught history there was sitting across from me, and she said, "So Jerry, why are you a Christian?" I thought she was asking because she wanted to know. But this insider information must keep us engaged honestly with the material. And I looked at her and I said, I'm a Christian because I'm aware of failure in my life. I'm aware of incongruity. I believe in the high ideal of love. There are these deep convictions that we all have within. I believe in the high ideal of love, but I've had sharp words with people I say I love most in the world. I believe in justice, I said. But there have been times I've been unfair in my treatment of others. I didn't set out to be unfair, but I realize in retrospect I had been. And I don't think I could make it in life, I said to this woman, if I didn't know there was such a thing called forgiveness. Who has ever lived one moment of honest life without the realization that we need to be forgiven? And also I said, I became a Christian because I was overwhelmed by the message of God's love. which is an unconditional love, freely given. It's ontological. That means it can't be improved by my well-doing, nor diminished by my poor doing. So consequently, I said that love that is freely given makes it possible not only for me to come to God for forgiveness, but also out of that love to go and ask forgiveness of the people I might have hurt. And I said, that's why I'm a Christian. The woman was taken back by that answer. She said, well, I can appreciate that, but that's just not my issue. I said, I think I understand what you're saying. I didn't become a Christian until I was in my first year of university. And I said, but I didn't become perfect overnight. That took 2 or 3 weeks before that happened. And as soon as I said that, the entire high table of all the faculty busted up in gut-wrenching laughter. When the laughter subsided, I looked at the woman and I said, your laughter just betrayed you. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, you and I just met, so you don't know the specifics in my life that made that statement that I had achieved perfection nonsense. But either your read of history or your read of your own life has told you that nobody has it together. And so consequently, this brokenness, this insider information keeps us mindful of the fact that we need more. And I said, in knowing what you know about yourself, what gets you by? She says, I have faith in humanity. I said, I'm interested in anything that's going to help me, but let me ask you about your faith in humanity. Have you ever been wounded by another human being before? She said, of course. I said, have you ever wounded another human being before? She said, I suppose so. She was a little softer on herself. I said, given the fact that we live in such a broken world, how does this faith in humanity work then? And just then, the man sitting next to her who taught French there said, how does it work for Christians? And we spent the rest of the dinner engaging in the themes of the grace of God and the forgiveness of God and the love of God, the very kinds of themes that Lewis, building his speculation about natural law, then develops throughout the rest of mere Christianity. So what does this all mean for us? Lewis's interest in the natural law and how it drove him to faith. I would suggest to you, for Lewis, it brought him to the place of humility, where he realized that he couldn't live up to the standards that he had set for himself. But he also realized that there was a God of grace who made available forgiveness, who loved him in spite of what he did or didn't do. And consequently, that love gave him the freedom to fail, which is the freedom to grow. And also, I would suggest to you, there was a humility that came to him, a gratitude that came to him, a magnanimity that came to him, whereby the generosity he had received from God, he was willing to extend to others in his world. And it becomes quite a model for us.
After graduating from Oxford, the young Jack Lewis stayed on at the world's most prestigious university, not as a student, but now as a don, a tutor. On June 25th, 1925, he was formally admitted as a fellow here at Magdalen College, named after Mary Magdalene, but keeping its Middle English pronunciation of Magdalen. Lewis was 26. It is a formidable ceremony, he wrote to his father, and not entirely to my taste. Being one of the largest of the colleges at Oxford, Magdalen had a sizable faculty. As part of the admissions ritual, Jack was required to stand in front of them all while the college vice president addressed him for 5 minutes in Latin. At the end of this exhortation, Lewis was required to kneel on a red cushion which had been especially provided for the event. That done, the vice president took Jack by the hand and raised him to his feet with the words, "I wish you joy." Jack tripped a little on his gown while rising, but he took consolation that at least the ceremony was over, or so he thought. Instead, he was sent around the room where each of the fellow dons shook his hand and repeated the same phrase, "I wish you joy." What Jack could not have foreseen was how soon this wish would come true, albeit in a way he never could have expected. Lewis became friends with a wide variety of the faculty. Many were believers, including J.R.R. Tolkien. Lewis intended to influence them with his skepticism, but to his surprise, they began to influence him. Through these friends, Lewis came to see Christianity as intellectually credible, and despite his great desire to be left alone by God, if God existed, a great change took place in him. Understanding that we all have a sense of right and wrong, and that there must be something or someone real behind this universal experience was a pivotal first step for Lewis. It would not be his last. In our next session, we'll explore Christianity's shocking alternative explanation for the universe and our place in it.
Let's see. There, yeah, we're back. Well, what do you think of the video? Did it help you answer any of the questions that you might have had from the reading? I know that there were questions about the naturalist view, which was what was primarily talked about in chapter 4 about it, and probably those stinking scientists. It was maybe a little bit confusing. Some of the things that I think are interesting is C.S. Lewis was, after he graduated, he was assigned to a university, or he was hired by a university that was primarily Christian. And so he may have had no desire to become involved in Christianity, but apparently someone had a different idea for him and placed him at a point where C.S. Lewis said, well, I'm going to show them, I'm going to teach them that what they believe is bunkers. I don't know if that's a British term or not, and instead he ends up being influenced just the other way. We started today by reading those verses from Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. And when, I forget what the narrator today or the speaker today, he was talking about insider information, that we have insider information. And that's what Paul was talking about. He was talking about the insider information that even people who have not been exposed to God have an idea of right and wrong, and where that right and wrong comes from. So when we start to look at chapter 4 today, we start to think about science a little bit. And like a scientist could come in here and he could measure the temperature in this room. And that was one of the examples he used. He was talking about a pot of boiling water and say, well, why is it this temperature? And you could all say, well, you probably, the first words out of, I'm sure, Patty's mouth would be, well, the molecules in the air are being vibrating at such a point that they're creating 72 degrees. And my answer would, that's not the case. I came in and I thought it was cold, and so I raised the thermostat to 72. And so there's two different explanations. One explanation is quantifiable, and that's the science sort of explanation. The other is kind of our emotion, our reasoning, our intellect. I was cold, so I raised the temperature. And we a lot of times have such situations in our life. You know, Barb down there might have gone to the convenience store before she came here, and she might have gotten a 2-liter bottle of soda because she was really thirsty. But they were out of 2 liters, so she had to get 4 16s. And so she drank them all, and that's going to cause another situation later. So we can quantify how much was drank, but we can't really quantify, we can't really identify, we can't really say why Barb, in her silliness, drank 64 ounces of soda before she came today. And that she, of course, didn't. So in chapter 4, we're talking about scientists, and we're talking about, is there something beyond science? And we can see that there is something beyond science, because science can measure things. Science can see some things. Maybe they got an electron microscope and they can see really tiny little things. But there was a time when people thought that matter was homogeneous. You know what that means? That matter was all the same. And so then they started looking and could look and got a microscope, and then got an electron microscope, and then beyond that, and they see that every time they think that they've gotten matter quantified, they find out, oh, there's something even more. It breaks down even more. There's more particles that we don't understand. Because everybody might remember that in math in high school, we talked about electrons and neutrons and protons. But now we talk about quarks and mesons and muons and all sorts of things, and it just keeps going down. And the universe is much more complex and much harder to explain than what we can quantify. So in chapter 4, you could say that the whole point of chapter 4 was to show us that even if we believe in the naturalist or the materialist view, there's something beyond. There's something beyond the explanation that we can see in those. And I appreciated much more so when he was talking about the Hamlet and Shakespeare, when he was talking there, than when I read it, because I didn't really get what he was saying when he read it. But when he was talking about it there, he said, you know, we sit here and say, well, Hamlet couldn't have known Shakespeare. Why couldn't Hamlet know Shakespeare? Because Shakespeare was Hamlet's creator. And the only way that Shakespeare could be known to Hamlet would be if Shakespeare, in his writing, wrote himself into the play. And then Hamlet could know Shakespeare. And so what he was talking about there was God decided that he needed to write himself into the play. For some reason, and that's going to be one of those things that we talk in more detail, God decides to write himself into the play. And C.S. Lewis began to understand that God wrote himself into the play, into the world, when he came as what we call Emmanuel, God with us, God incarnate, God into the world. So that's what he was talking there. So we talked about insider information, and we talked about God writing himself into the play. And last week when we started this, I told you about a trip I had from Newcastle, coming up from Newcastle toward Hartford City. I was coming home from work, and I started thinking about right and wrong. And I can even tell you it was a July 2nd. And so I was coming up and I thought, you know, you see lots of different examples of right and wrong as you're driving along our roadways, don't you? And, you know, even if you intend to do the right thing at all times, anybody ever decided that they're going to do the right thing from now on? Anybody ever done that? Haven't we all? Did you ever fail at that, or have you reached perfection? We all failed at that when we tried, didn't we? But we have this sense of right and wrong. And sometimes, like in the quarrel, we get offended when we see people who are not doing what we think is the right thing to do. We all have this understanding of right and wrong. And for me, as I was driving along, I was thinking, well, right there, there's a white sign with a black lettering, and it says speed limit 60. And so, you know, you set your cruise control at at 60 and you're driving along, and it's not very long before you realize that other people have a different sense of right and wrong. You know, sometimes we come up to those red signs that have 4-letter words on them, and it's not the one you're thinking of. It's stop. It says stop. And we see that that does not mean stop. It might mean slow down. It might mean look for cars, but by and large, we've stopped stopping at stop signs. Oh, that's 3 stops in a row. And so this sense of right and wrong. So is there, for me, I was trying to decide, well, does it really matter then? If there's no real sense of right and wrong, does it really matter what I do? Because at that point, I was an atheist. This would have been somewhere around 2006 or so. And so, you know, if there's no ultimate sense of right and wrong, it doesn't really matter what we do, does it? It's just an opinion. But if, as Paul writes about, that we have written on our hearts something beyond just our own opinion, then maybe it does matter what was right or wrong. And to finish my story, another time when I was driving home from work in Dunkirk, I was coming across 400 South in Blackford County. You know, there's a train track between Eaton and Hartford City, and I came up to that train track, and I stopped, and I had always thought that evil in the world proved that God couldn't exist. And I had impressed upon my heart at that point, well, how do you explain good in the world? How do you explain those people who choose to run into a fire to save someone else, who put their lives in jeopardy to save someone else? How do you explain good? I mean, it's easy to explain evil. Evil is self-serving generally. You know, when we decide that we're not going to, well, that's not a good example because I don't know if paying, well, I suppose we are called to pay our tax. We're supposed to render to Caesar what is Caesar's. And so you can certainly say that it would be a sin to intentionally withhold some of the money that's owed. So, you know, that could be seen as something evil, you know, and, you know, there's all sorts of ways that we can do things that we know that we're supposed to do. But if we're going to do what we're supposed to do, we have to know why it's what we're supposed to do. And, you know, the people who do good for others without expecting, you know, at their own personal expense, you know, how do you explain that? You can explain evil. You can explain people cheating on their taxes. You can explain people speeding because they didn't get up in time, and so they're going to be late for work. And if they're late for work, they're going to get fired because they didn't call. So there'll be a no call, no show, and they'll get fired. And really, it had nothing, it was just poor planning on their part. But how do you explain good? How do you explain good if there isn't some overriding force? If something hasn't been written on our hearts? If there isn't an ultimate right and wrong? And that's what Mr. Lewis is pointing us toward, is that ultimate right or wrong. He's pointing us toward something beyond ourselves, something that's outside of ourselves. Because it wasn't a coincidence that he talked about a make-believe world, Hamlet's world, and someone who would be seen as God. Deus ex machina is a Latin phrase, and it talks about, it was really popular in Greek plays because the hero would be about to be killed and a big sunlight would come down from above and the hero would be rescued, and God from machine. It was a saving that was like God saving something. And so Shakespeare could be that to Hamlet. And so for me, right and wrong was very formidable in my faith because it was what God used to draw me to himself. Anybody want to say anything?
So you were stopped at this railroad track. I want to hear the rest of your story.
I was stopped at the railroad track, and it was impressed upon my heart that the thing that had been keeping me from believing in God, God used to lead me to him when he impressed upon my heart that how do you explain good? How can you deny my existence based on evil? How can you be such a hypocrite when you recognize that there is good in the world? And it made me think, well, if there is good in the world, maybe good that could only be self-serving, or good that would not be self-serving, there must be something more, something from outside. Maybe there is the ultimate right. And so I don't know, it was in 2006, I know in August, I was driving home from work. All my stories involve driving. But it was August, I know that. So starting July and now it's August. It was a really hot day in August, and something broke at work, and I ended up having to lift something that was really heavy. It was one of those really dog days of, I know it's dog days of July, but it was actually August. But anyway, it was really hot and humid, and I don't know if I had a heat stress or what it was, but as I was driving home from work, I passed out on the way home driving, and when I woke up, there was someone tapping on the window, and for whatever reason, I had stopped at 3. I didn't just drive across 3 coming home from Dunkirk. I stopped, and it was the pastor from the Church of God in Eaton, and I was certainly not myself, and so I gave him my phone, I guess, and he called 911, and I spent 3 days at Ball. But when I had kind of recovered from that, I saw kind of another intervention in my life, and Mom suggested that maybe we ought to go to church. So we tried the church at Eaton, at the Church of God, and it was more contemporary than they wanted. So we picked Grace, and we decided we would try Grace. And I thought, well, that's good. It's a big church. There will be lots of people. And so I won't have to get involved. That was my intention. And the first time we sat down, and the seats that Mom and Dad still sat when they're able to come, because we're Methodist and we have to sit in our assigned seats. Lloyd Hall sat down behind us and was very welcoming. And, that's a year later, I was a Christian. But that's right and wrong kind of led me to God. And I think that it's interesting that C.S. Lewis, because I know I didn't read C.S. Lewis before I was a Christian, but I read the Bible, but that was just to make fun of other people. But
yeah, I grew up in this church, and we moved here when I started middle school, and but it wasn't until I came back here. I've been sitting in the same. When I came back in the same pew every time, because I had there's some other people like me, my mom and stuff were there. So after I've been coming here for a few months, some guy I never seen before says, "You're sitting in my seat." I never heard that name. I thought it was hilarious because I actually didn't care where I sat, but I just thought that was important to somebody here. So, but see, you're talking about rules, like like on the speed limit there, you're assuming your speedometer is correct, and it really does say it doesn't say upper limit, it just says speed limit. It could be a lower limit. If you're a pilot, there's a lot of lower limits that are really, or if you operate nuclear power plants, there's a lot of lower limits that are just important. But see, this is, you start talking about regulations, like, this is a piddly thing that just happened in Germany, but a lot of the Autobahn, or parts of the Autobahn, don't have a speed limit. So a few days ago, this guy.
But when they do have a speed limit, are you suggesting that that's a minimum?
No.
So most people would recognize the sign that says speed limit as a maximum.
Well, but a lot of free state, even in this country, a lot of the interstates say minimum speed.
Minimum, so speed limit and minimum.
I'm just saying it's right, but so they don't have, parts of the Autobahn don't have any speed limit. So this happened a few days ago. This guy in a Bugatti Chiron was caught on cameras going 260 miles an hour. It's actually a lot faster than that, but it's pretty. It's one of the fastest cars in the world. And it's just one you can buy if you got $3 million. It's just a regular street legal, and but they seem to be irate about it, saying it's like maybe not responsible. They checked the road and they had that they drove the whole thing and they made sure there's no cars on. It was done at like 4 o'clock in the morning.
So what is our first inclination when someone says that, well, the speed limit, that your speedometer could be wrong, your speedometer, well, most speedometers in cars are wrong. Most of them read higher than your actual speed, because there was a lawsuit against the Honda Motor Company of America in 1993, and their speedometers were actually reading lower than the car was actually going. And so there was this big class action lawsuit. And so from that point on, at least most cars made or sold in America, your speedometer reads lower than your actual speed.
I think they're within, I don't know, I think they're usually within a half mile an hour now, the new
But-
electronic stuff.
Right, but we don't really need to get bogged down in speedometers, but
I'm just making a point about you could be getting upset about somebody. It's not even.
absolutely, you could just be, if you were talking about the car that was going 60.5 mile per hour that was passing you when you were going 60, that you can kind of say, okay, but for the cars that are passing you that are going 80 and in the 60, you can make a reasonable guess that they're probably exceeding what the limit is.
I coming back from Michigan, I got passed by 2 police cars that were going over 100 in heavy traffic. And the only reason they were going to is somebody was off the side of the road that their car had stopped. So.
So our questions today from chapter 2, or excuse me, on
4.
session 2.
But it's, they got a bunch of them.
Oh, they do? Oh, thank you.
So the materialist view and the religious or supernatural view, are you kind of offended when he calls the religious view and supernatural view? Does that kind of offend you? Because what do we think about when we hear about supernatural?
Ghost.
Yeah, ghosts and things like that, things that we see in fiction and stuff. And sometimes it seems it's just a little bit offensive to us when we talk about God, but isn't God outside of the natural order? Isn't he something beyond? I mean, Jerry Root used the word ontological. Isn't that a great big word? But there was a philosopher, and I forget when, early in the Christian period, maybe around 500 or 600 AD, and his name was Anselm. And Anselm had this ontological view of God, and he said that God was that thing that no greater can exist. And because God is the creator of everything, and so everything would have to be beneath, below, so nothing greater could exist. And that's called Anselm's ontological view of God. And so wouldn't he be super, as in greater than nature? But I still am always offended when people describe, or, I have to stop and think about it when somebody says God is supernatural. But certainly is. I mean, raise people from the dead, created the heavens and the earth. If the heavens and the earth are nature, then the creator of those would have to be super nature beyond that. But anyway, he was talking about the materialist view and the religious or supernatural view. And so that jumped out to me as far as, do we consider being religious, being Christian, being supernatural? Maybe not us, but maybe there's a spark of something in us that's beyond nature, that supernaturalist view. So I lived my life. I would say that I was a very rational person for most of my life. And I spent 20 years in nuclear power in the Navy, and all about quantifiable. And when this happened, you did this and those sorts of things. And so for me, I was certainly a person that believed greatly in science. And for me, becoming a Christian was very eye-opening, because I got to learn that there were so many things that are beyond science and beyond our ability to understand. And I think that people say, well, being a Christian, that's wishful thinking. That's just hoping that there's something beyond, and there's no real evidence that there's something beyond what we can see in our world. And so last week after class, I mentioned a book by Charles Colson to Brent. And in that book, it's called So What? Oh, I can't remember.
Now,
It's something like So What Now? What now shall we believe, or something like that.
how now shall we live?
Yeah. How now shall we live? And in that book, Charles Colson, and he goes around, he's not a great scientist or a great theologian, but he went around and he talked to lots of people. And scientists might explain away, well, we've got a big bang, and after the big bang, the thing spiraled out and then spiraled out, and eventually there were so many planets and there's so many suns in the galaxy and in the universe that sooner or later we just happened to reach the point where life could naturally come into existence on a little dirt ball 3 planets away from the sun. And so if you talk to scientists about, they can calculate odds for things like that, the odds of life naturally evolving are, I figured it out once, but you're like 8 million times more likely to win the Powerball every time the draw is for a year than for life to naturally evolve on the earth. And The thing about scientists is sometimes when they're explaining why things can happen, sometimes they cheat. Because yes, they can make amino acids kind of group together in what become the building blocks of life. But every time they have to restart the experiment at that final point so that it's step by step. And it's kind of unreasonable to think that, okay, for this part of the experiment, the only way the amino acids will group together is if there's no UV light. And then for the next step, there has to be UV light. And there has to be high CO2 here, but there has to be low CO2 here. And so all these things have to happen for life to naturally evolve. It's much easier to believe, and that's the point that C.S. Lewis is moving us toward. It's much easier to believe in something beyond ourselves that's influencing what happens than to think that things can just accidentally happen. So that's kind of view on materialist view and supernatural view. You folks said that you had to reread chapter 4 several times. What was your issue as you were going through chapter 4?
To understand what he's saying.
Well, was there anything in particular that you were having trouble understanding? I'm not meaning to put you on the spot, just
Yeah. Just his different views, explaining it in different ways that he's putting it out there.
okay. If you could next time, just kind of circle it, or
Okay.
and then we could talk about what the issues might have been in his explanation. Because I understand sometimes we come upon words and it's in two ways his writing is removed from us. One is that it was written 70 years ago, and the other way is that it was written in a different, similar but still a different culture where the things that we take for granted, figures of speech and stuff, are unfamiliar to us. So
we talked a little bit Sunday afternoon, and he uses different terminology. Sometimes he calls it moral law, then he might call it the law of human nature, and then and different things that he would call different things, and you had to figure out maybe basically what he was referring to. So, and that was a little confusing.
Right. Well, that's reasonable. And moral would be right.
Mhm.
Moral law would be right. And natural law, when he's talking about natural law, he's talking about something that is written within us, some sense that we have of right and wrong. And because we all do seem to have a sense of right and wrong, which was kind of the point of him talking about a quarrel, because those two people who are quarreling have a sense that they're right. And the person who is wrong, in his example, seems to have a sense that, okay, yeah, it might have been wrong. Even he recognizes that what he had done might be wrong, but he had a reason why he did it. And so, I think you can look at the lady, Jerry, what's his name, was talking about sitting at the high table, and he was talking to the lady, and she had a sense of what was right and wrong. And so he was able to explain his position to her, but even after he explained it, she still didn't necessarily agree with that position. But when we have arguments with people, sometimes we get a little bit emotional. Anybody ever gotten emotional during an argument? probably never happens between husbands and wives or friends or anything, where we get a little bit emotional and we aren't reasoning very well, or sometimes we feel a little bit guilty, don't we? Anybody ever felt guilty because you got into an argument and you were supporting a position that you knew was wrong, but you know you weren't going to back down, you were just going to continue, and you kind of were digging yourself a hole, and finally the sides of the hole fell in on you and you were just buried. And sometimes when we get into those situations where we know we're wrong and we don't want to admit we're wrong, we start to feel a little bit guilty. Why do we feel guilty?
We knew he was wrong,
Why do we feel guilty when we know we're wrong?
because we have it in our heart that we know better.
Because we understand
Yeah.
that sometimes there's a right and a wrong. And, you know, I told you a story about me and finally recognizing that if there is right and wrong, for right and wrong to actually matter, the only way it can matter is if there's an ultimate right and wrong. Because if there isn't an ultimate right and wrong, then it's just my opinion. And why is my opinion better than Brent's? Or why is my opinion better than Pat's or Barb's?
Some of it has to do also with, like, if there are no consequences. Like if there are no consequences for those people driving 100 miles an
Yeah.
hour, they're going to continue doing it. And if there are no consequences as of us not stopping because there's no cars around, you know, we will continue doing. So then it kind of changes what we actually think is right and wrong, because we've moved it.
Well, that's right. We've rationalized our behavior to the point where, okay, yeah, maybe it's wrong, but it's not really very badly wrong. It's not
Nothing's
really
gonna
that
happen to
wrong.
me.
Nothing's going to happen to me. The consequences, you're right. If there aren't consequences, we can rationalize things away. And, you know, for the example of a stop sign, can we think of consequences where that would have been the wrong choice?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, because we just drove across and, you know, every summer it seems like, you know, we learn that stop signs don't really mean stop, right? That's what we learn. It becomes a habit. And then in the summertime, when the corn's 6 feet tall and we come up to the stop sign, we trained ourselves all winter that we don't really have to stop. And, you know, it's not hard, and it happens almost every summer that someone runs a stop sign and they couldn't see anything because of the corn. And, you know, it's easy to see the consequences. So in that case, would we still see that it was wrong not to stop when the consequence was someone losing their
Oh,
lives
sure.
or us losing our life? So doesn't that mean that it was always wrong? Yeah. So, you know, we can rationalize our behavior. Anybody ever called in for sick for work and you weren't really sick? We're probably at the age where we would have thought about doing that, but
You have to live with yourself.
you have to live with yourself. Why? Because there's something in us, something driving us to an understanding that some things are not right. Some things are not right. Those things are wrong, that aren't right. And so, you know, we can rationalize that we really weren't speeding very much. And, you know, I tell myself when I speed, it's 2 miles or more or less over the speed limit. When I speed, I tell myself that my speedometer is probably that inaccurate. So it's probably okay. And then I find comfort in knowing that everybody's going around me being the rabbit. So if somebody's going to get a ticket, it's not going to be me for 2 miles per hour. But I'm even rationalizing that behavior. And my speedometer, if it, instead of being 2 miles high, could be 2 miles low. And so,
Barb says you can go 4 miles over.
so
That's what I always say.
yeah.
Okay, 55, I can go 60, or 59.
So this thing that's inside us that tells us right and wrong, where does it come from? Because that's what we're talking about. It can't be of ourselves. It can't be society, because society tells us that whatever we can get away with is fine. It's okay to cheat on your taxes because, you know, if you use like a TurboTax or one of those software programs, at the end of it, even when you know that you've cheated on your taxes, it says the likelihood of audit less than 1%. So we say,
Oh, okay.
you know, it's okay, right? It's just like we train ourselves to right and wrong. But, you know, in the example of when we finally run the stop sign at the wrong time and we kill ourselves or someone else, or just cause a collision and no one's hurt. You know, up to that point, we were fine with getting away with whatever we could get away with. So this sense of right and wrong comes from somewhere. And I thought that we would end today talking about our own faith. And as we're all members or at least attenders of Grace United Methodist Church, you know, the person who was most responsible for Methodism was Charles Wesley, or excuse me, John Wesley. Charles was his brother. He talks about that thing that's in us that makes us understand right and wrong. He calls that a knowledge of divine things. And what he's talking about is he's talking about prevenient grace, what he termed prevenient grace. And, you know, we've all heard the term grace, and John Wesley talks about prevenient grace. And that's his term for what God uses to draw us to himself. Because none of us come through or come to saving faith in God except through God calling us back into relationship with him. And so one of the things that we learn, and what Paul was writing about, where those people, those Gentiles, had a knowledge of right and wrong, is something that we get through prevenient grace. An understanding that there's something outside of ourselves. There's something that God is using to call us to him. And I know we're a little bit ahead as far as what Mr. Lewis is going to continue to talk about next week. But in our faith, in our denomination especially, we see prevenient grace as that grace that God draws us with. Like when I was sitting there, and it was impressed upon me that if, as I thought, evil in the world was proof that God did not exist, how do I explain good? How can you think that how can you explain people doing good? It's not self-serving. It's unselfish. It's selfless a lot of times. And so something happens in a person that they see the value in doing good instead of doing evil. So when we talk about prevenient grace, Wesley mentioned two different aspects about prevenient grace. He said, first is a renewed possibility of basic knowledge of the divine things. A basic knowledge of divine things, things that are outside of ourselves. good instead of evil, doing right instead of wrong, being moral instead of being immoral, doing the right thing even when it cost us. Anybody ever done something right that ended up costing you? In the Navy, that was the definition of integrity, doing the right thing regardless of personal cost, doing the right thing. And you know, sometimes if you made a mistake, maybe your first inclination is to hide that mistake. But instead of hiding that mistake, you step forward and you say, no, that I did that. It was wrong. I did that. That would be demonstrating personal integrity. So a divine understanding, perhaps it's looking at a beautiful sunset or a sunrise or all those flowers that were in that video and seeing something beyond just an accident, that the beauty in our world is a result not of an accident, but it's as God created it. You know, in the opening prayer, I talked about general revelation, where God reveals himself not just to those who are seeking him, but to everyone. Jesus tells us that the rain falls on the good and the evil. It falls just on the immoral, just like it does on the moral. God's blessing exists to all those. That would be another example of God revealing himself to everyone. And so prevenient grace is one of those things that God uses to draw us to him. To draw us to him and identify that there is something beyond just the things that are in the world. There's something more. So that was one thing, divine things. And the second aspect is a rudimentary discernment of the difference between moral good and evil. Being able to discern that there is good and evil. That's what C.S. Lewis has been talking to us about all along. Is God reveals himself and he draws himself or draws us to himself by impressing upon our hearts there is a good and there is an evil. There's a morally good and there is morally evil, and there's a difference between them. And God uses that to draw us to him. That it's not an accident. And so while C.S. Lewis perhaps wouldn't use the term prevenient grace, what he was saying is something that this particular author, Randy Maddox, defined as being prevenient grace, using the knowledge of that there is moral and there is immorality, there is good, morally good, and there is morally evil. And when we come to understand that, that's a way that we're focused upon God. I don't know if I was going to say anything else. The second aspect is a rudimentary discernment, basic discernment, a basic revealing of the difference between moral good and evil, providing a standard by which our conscience can assess our lives. That prevenient grace that John Wesley talked about allows us, through the use of our conscience, to decide between what's good and what's evil. With the full intention, God using that to draw us to himself. Because we're separated from God, because there's evil in the world. Well, what do you think?
Well, just listening to the news can be
upsetting.
Because there's so much evil in the world. There's so much wrong in the world. And, I think that a lot of the different stations, whether it's broadcast or whether it's the papers, sometimes they do try to put more uplifting stories where people do good, and they do try to reveal that. It apparently doesn't sell newspapers. And apparently, you look at the NBC nightly news, the last couple minutes each time they try to do a more uplifting story, but it's hard to combat 25 minutes of bad with 5 minutes of good. But you're right, it's hard. And we see people doing wrong almost every time we go out, don't we? And sometimes don't we see, if we see the person doing it, we'd have to look in the mirror, the people doing wrong. And that was another thing that was mentioned in the video today, that sometimes we see ourselves doing wrong. And just like we were talking about in Prevenient Grace, that rudimentary sense of right and wrong allows our conscience to determine between good and evil. Sometimes don't we have to turn our focus back upon ourselves? And so where does that leave us? Because it seems like we're kind of in trouble, because we know what we're supposed to do. This is where we are right now. We know where we're supposed to do, but we don't always do it. Paul told us that in Romans. He said, I know what I'm supposed to do, and I find myself doing just the opposite.
Well, and I think Lewis in here said that about, figuring out that there is something that makes us want to do good, but we see ourselves not doing it.
Absolutely. And so that's kind of where he left us this week, is with that understanding that we want to do good. We can't always do good. And so why do we want to do good? And so that's the next question that he's going to work toward answering the question of, why do we want to do good? There has to be something more. So that's what we'll talk about next week. So our reading assignment for the next time we meet, and that's not even a reading list. I think it's 1 and 2 in book 2. Yeah, book 2, chapter 1 and 2. And so when we get to book 3, we only read chapter 1 and chapter 8. That's on the 2nd of March. I'd recommend you read all of it, but we'll primarily look at chapter 1 and 8. Does anybody have any other comments or anything that they'd like to discuss as far as our study up to this point? Okay, well, we'll just end here then. We'll stop recording.